So let's begin. In what sense can I speak of the dominant core economic powerhouse in the world being the BRICS today? And when I finish with the economics, I'll turn to the politics, and then I'll turn to the military. Not because the military is all that important, but it's because that's what frightens the United States and so many people when it needn't. Here we go. The simplest broad measure of economic bigness, economic power, economic strength is something called the GDP, the gross domestic product, the total value of goods and services produced in a year.
These nations are trying to reduce dependence on the US dollar and escape the leverage of American sanctions.
I call this one the importance of the BRICS. And by that I mean, of course, the new global economic powerhouse comprised of those initials, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. At the very end of August, they have gathered, most of them, not all, but most, in China to celebrate a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, which includes a number of BRICS members in China and in Asia, and also to celebrate victory over the Japanese 80 years ago at the end of World War II.
Richard Wolff has frequently highlighted the growing importance of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, as a counterweight to the traditional dominance of Western powers.
But I want to talk to you about the BRICS. And I want you to understand not so much that the BRICS represent a challenge to the United States, which is what the Trump administration and the Biden administration shared as a view, but rather to get us to understand as a nation what the enormous importance of the BRICS has become. And that is as much in reaction to Biden and Trump as for reasons of their own. But I think when I'm done, in the few minutes I will take, will leave you with the impression that you ought to have, that we, you and I, are living through an historic transformation, one economic powerhouse, the center of economic growth.
For Wolff, the BRICS alliance is not merely about diplomatic symbolism.
And wealth and prosperity is giving way to another. This has happened many times in European history. It has happened many times in world history. Empires arise and they evolve and then they pass away, giving room to others. And sometimes we haven't had a dominating empire. We don't seem to need one, but we've had them for quite a while. They come and they go. BRICS is the new dominant economic powerhouse center.
It is a material sign that countries outside the West are asserting economic independence.
I'm going to show you that in a moment. The United States and its major allies, the so-called G7, that include beyond the United States, Japan, Canada, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. They are now fading. They are not the dominant center anymore, and it is highly unlikely I can't predict the future any more than anyone else can, but from everything I see, it's highly likely this pattern, rise of the BRICS, decline of the G7, is going to change anytime soon.
By developing their own trade networks, financial institutions, and monetary frameworks,
The United Nations and many others keep track of the GDP year in and year out of all countries. So we know, for example, what the GDP of the United States is, and we know what the GDP of China is. We likewise know, because we can add them up, what the GDP is of the United States and the 6 allies that make up the G7. And we know what the GDP is of China and its allies, namely now the BRICS, BRICS. Here we go, folks. These numbers scream a simple message if you dare listen. If you add up the GDP of the United States and its 6 major allies, the so-called G7, it works out to about 29% of the total output of our planet is accomplished by those 7 countries.
the push for a BRICS-based alternative currency, for instance, demonstrates how dissatisfied much of the world has become with dollar hegemony.
We have 195 countries in the world, but those 7 alone do 28% of the world's output. What about China and the BRICS? If you add them all up in the same way, they work out to be producing approximately 34 or 35% of the world's output. So please simply understand, China and the BRICS are a bigger, larger in terms of output, and therefore richer in terms of product than the G7. That's been true since the year 2020, and the gap between them gets larger each year since 2020, including 2024 and 2025, as I speak to you.
He stresses that this movement is not accidental, but a direct response to decades of Western economic policy.
But more than that, the GDP, if you break it down, will tell us what has happened to the core manufacturing industry at the base of any economy. And that we all know because you can see it. Industry, which was once something that characterized Western Europe, only and then moved out of Western Europe, which lost much of its industry because it moved to the United States, to Japan, to other parts of the world. Well, it keeps moving. It always did. It always does.
When Washington weaponized finance through sanctions, it pushed other nations to build parallel systems.
And starting in the 1970s, large industrial corporations in the United States, most of them, discovered that they could make more money, become more profitable by doing 3 things in a big way. Number 1, move production out of the United States to China, India, Brazil, other places. Nobody put up a gun to their head. No one forced them. Not the foreign government, which never had the power, nor the American government. They demanded the American government help them move abroad, maintain the military all over the world to make it safe to do business at a great distance. But they went and they set up their factories over there and they closed them here.
When the International Monetary Fund imposed austerity programs, it drove countries to look for alternative sources of credit.
And we all know which parts of America, New England, the Rust Belt, and large of the parts of the rest of the United States sit empty and idle because those companies made more money. If you were a shareholder, you got a piece of the extra profits, which is why the stock market does real well while the economy is hollowed out. The second thing they did was replace workers with machines, automation. And the third thing they did is bring in cheap immigrants. When you can't make more money by going over there where the cheap labor is, you bring it here. That's what they did. And for the 10% of our people who own the companies of this country, it was wonderful. We've had a stock market boom where they became rich. But the other 90% didn't. And that's most of you. I want to call this one the BRICS, another step forward. The BRICS have just had, I believe it's their 17th annual meeting in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, hosted by the leader there, Mr. Lula. And I want to talk about the significance of this institution, the BRICS. Next year, it will be hosted by Mr. Modi, the leader of India, and I believe it will take place in India. They welcomed a new member, Indonesia. I want to remind people Indonesia has a population of 280 million people, only a little bit smaller than the United States. The BRICS again, for those who may still not know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They also have a dozen partner nations that are part of the BRICS and are slowly and steadily being integrated into them. Before I talk about the significance of their meetings and what they've decided to do sooner, some later, I want to also mention a milestone that they achieved just a few weeks ago, when it was announced that they just crossed $1 trillion. That is the value of the trade among members of the BRICS. $1 trillion worth of trade. Why is that important? Well, it's important because that's what the BRICS is about. Doing international trade on their own, out from under the domination of the United States. And that's indeed why the BRICS are important. They are not anti-American, as Mr. Trump casually likes to say. That's really not relevant to them. What they are interested in doing is becoming a part of a world economy that isn't anymore dominated by the US dollar as the global currency, by the US military as a kind of policeman for what trade can or cannot happen, as the source of goods they have to buy, markets they have to sell into, money they have to borrow, investments they have to secure. The United States came out of World War II dominant. All the other potential competitors had been destroyed economically and often also militarily and politically by World War II. And by that I mean Japan, China, Russia, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Canada, you name it. They could not compete for one reason or another. The United States, king of the hill. Now, of course, any reasonable person with even a minimal grasp of history would have known that these were very special, very odd circumstances, and that the dominance of the United States, the dollar as the global currency, the United States as the producer of all producers, whether it was manufacturing or services or financial instruments, didn't matter. The US dominated. It had the atom bomb. It had the overwhelming military, etc. Anyone with a good sense of history would have known this can't last. The advanced economies like Germany and Japan would come back. Yes, they would take a while, but they had the brain power, they had the institutions. And then there were the countries in Western Europe that had also achieved quite high levels of development. And there were the dark horses, if you like, Russia, China. No one quite knew whether they would come back from their destruction, and if so, how quickly. No one imagined what the Russians could do, and no one even had the faintest idea of what the Chinese proved they could do after World War II. Well, Americans were a little naive. They indulged themselves in believing it would last forever. Well, it didn't. And we now know that, but the BRICS is the most organized global manifestation. And that's why it's important to take note of the annual meeting they just had in Rio and the fact that they are bigger than they have ever been before, that they're doing more trade with one another than they ever did before, that they're borrowing money and making investments in one another more than they ever did before. And all of that is happening outside of and out from under the control, the domination of the United States. This is not to be confused with a lot of verbiage about de-dollarization. That's talk that's mostly symbolic. At this point, there isn't a substitute for the US dollar that could be the alternative they go to. They are looking to settle their payments with one another in each other's currencies and working out a way to keep track of all of that. And the technology, blockchain and others, now exists to make that relatively straightforward. And they are going in that direction. Not to produce another currency other than the dollar. We're not at that point. That may develop, but we're not there. And that's not a priority of the BRICS. Even when they talk about it, it's clear they know that that's far in the future. They have to build the foundation. And what that means is economic development. And economic development based on their needs as the priority, not how they fit into a global economy dominated by the United States. That used to be what development meant. If you were a poor country in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and you went to Washington or you went to New York and you needed investment capital or you needed to open a market or you needed to secure supplies, you always got treated by saying, how can this thing you want be consistent with what we here want in New York and Washington? And a compromise was the outcome. You got something for your canal in Nigeria. You got something for your medical system in Paraguay, but you also had to do all of that within the framework of loan agreements that the United States imposed on you, trade agreements, or you had to be sure not to do something that the United States didn't want, because if you did, then they wouldn't be so forthcoming on whatever it is you needed. What the BRICS is about is creating within the world economy a new and different part of it. And that part is the part not subject to the United States' direct or indirect economic, political, and military power. Do they escape from that 100%? No. The United States remains a global force. I mean, there are three major wars in the world today: Ukraine, Gaza, and Iran, and the United States is a central player in every one of them. And before that, we had Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam, and I could go on. So the world is not free of the United States and will not be for quite some time. But the relative position of the United States is shrinking. And it has been for 50 years. Only it's going faster now because the institutions are being formed and developed and nurtured as we speak. It is no longer appropriate to talk about the United States being challenged by the economic powerhouse that China has become. That's still true, but it isn't the main story. The BRICS are the main story. China is the key part of that, no question. But the BRICS are much bigger than just China. And they are the new phenomena of the world economy and need to be understood in that way. They are quite different one from the other. They have clashes in their cultures, their religions, their political ambitions, their military capabilities. They have arguments. They will have more of them. They don't all look at the Israeli activity in Gaza in quite the same way, and so on. But whatever those differences, they are carving out a space in the world economy that is a new option for everyone. And I mean everyone, every company working internationally, every business, and every country is rethinking strategy. How do we grow this business? How do we diversify the people we borrow from, the people we sell to, the alliances we as a country make? All of those fundamental decisions about world affairs are being remade as I speak to you. Every country, every business is realizing that the world economy in which they are groping their way to a future is in the process of a fundamental change, and the BRICS is the absolute core of that. The BRICS together now account for about 35% of the world's total output of goods and services. 35% of the aggregate GDP of this planet. The G7, that's the United States and its 6 major allies, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, only account for 27, 28%. So the BRICS are already a bigger, richer, wealthier part of the world economy. That's why every company has to rethink its strategy. You can't focus on the G7, which for many of them was what they did kind of automatically for the last 75 years. That's not happening anymore. If you send a trade delegation to Washington and New York, which many of them do still, as soon as they're finished in Washington and New York, they go to New Delhi or Beijing or Sao Paulo in Brazil, and they present the same project. And they say, who can help us more? And the BRICS have gone out of their way, as I'm sure they will in the future, to carve their place in the world economy And they know that the way to do that is to offer a better deal than you can get in the West. They're not stupid. They know the game. It's just like if a new brand of soda pop is available in your neighborhood, it might offer a cheaper can or a cheaper bottle than the traditional soda pop in order to get you to try it, in order to get you to see that it's good, etc., etc. That's what's going on. Conventional marketing, if you like. But it's now clear that the world is never going to be what it was in the last 75 years. Peculiarly, oddly, anomalously in the history of the world economy, dominated by one country. Even the British, in the era of the British Empire, before the American Empire, didn't have the kind of control, never had the 800 military bases that the United States maintained, etc. So in a way, the United States peaked, its empire peaked, and it is now being challenged by somebody who has already surpassed the United States in number of ways. Militarily, you can see it in Ukraine.